very well in the book. And I got a couple emails from people saying, you know, I had a totally different read. I had that he was completely undervalued by New York, that they just didn't know what to do with him, that he was, you know, ahead of his time. And it was very interesting to hear that. You must get that reaction a lot about your books, because you yourself don't often say what you think. Sometimes you do, but often you, like you said, you leave it there for people to interpret.
Right. I try and be Switzerland and literally just stick to the facts. There's a lot of times when I I probably could, particularly in the interstitials, you know, spend a lot more time giving my opinion or showing my hand a little bit. But I think that that becomes more of a polemic than a book of record. And these books, I try and just literally, I try and do as much due diligence as possible on the facts. And then I let people, you know, kind of go to whatever place they think is right. In the case of Mike Lombardo, I agree with you, because I had a lot of people tell me, well, finally, Lombardo got to speak up for himself. And also he was able to clarify a lot of what happened in terms of his role in, you know, other people leaving HBO. And also for somebody who was always considered a business affairs guy, I mean, there are conversations about Mildred Pierce and other places where, you know, you see that he did have, you know, some creative insights that were really important to the company. And so I think a lot of people, you know, saw Mike Lombardo in a much more positive way than they had in the past.
That's interesting. You know, the shows, you're very careful in the book to go through all the shows, not all, but almost all the shows that a fan would want to know about. I'm curious, having spoken to so many people about the shows, what do you think the most influential, important show in the history of HBO was?
Oh, I mean, it's hardly, I mean, some people might say Game of Thrones, or some people like it's The Sopranos.
You think so? You're sure?
Yeah, I think so, because look, you have Oz and Gary and Larry Sanders beforehand, that were both very significant in the drama and comedy worlds. Obviously, Sex and the City, Curb, 6 Feet Under, The Wire is an incredible show. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But I think that what happened with The Sopranos was that HBO took a leap from being a good programming network that was talent friendly and gave a lot of freedom to creators, and they actually blasted through to being an entity that impacted the culture. I mean, I think that The Sopranos was much more than a television show. And God knows I'm not the first to say this, but I think, you know, the Richard Plepler word that he liked so much is the zeitgeist. I think, you know, The Sopranos changed storytelling. It changed a lot of things on television. And, you know, in terms of like the anti-hero, I mean, Tony Soprano was, you know, king of them. And I just think that the freedom that David Chase exhibited in terms of not pandering to the audience and really doing what he wanted to do. The Sopranos finale, of course, Cutting to Black, is the best example of that. I don't think we'd ever seen a show like that. And that became contagious for HBO. I mean, it started with Larry Sanders and Oz, like people were looking around saying, wait, we can go over there and we can do this and we can say this and whatever. But I think that, you know, from a more impactful level, The Sopranos really was the game changer.
One thing that surprised me about the early chapters of the book was how important sports were in the early days. That's something I didn't remember, you know, sort of before my time, specifically boxing. You know, the boxing legacy at HBO is huge. Why do you think they shied away from that in recent years? I know boxing is not boxing anymore, but even, you know, UFC or other forms of sports like that.
Well, Chris Albrecht wanted to do UFC. And I think that had he not left the company, there's a good chance that might have happened. But I think that, look, early on, HBO didn't have money for original programming for much of its infancy. And I think early on, boxing was something that they were able to wrestle away from the networks, because they said, listen, we're going to put it in prime time. You know, the networks had given up on boxing, and HBO did it just in time for like Mike Tyson and Marvin Hagler and Tommy Hearns and Sugar Ray Leonard. I mean, it was just like a perfect moment. They were also convinced early on that men controlled the remotes and men were buying HBO. And so it was a very male-centric service at that time. Basically, you know, every time HBO did something that they were kind of like succeeding with, all of a sudden it changed, because they start with this whole premise that we're going to give you movies right to your house. They're not going to have commercials and they're going to be uncut. Well, this is before Blockbuster. This is, you know, before other services. There's no streaming, there's no anything. So it's amazing that they were able to do that for as long as they did. But then all of a sudden, you have Blockbuster and you have other competitors, the Movie Channel and other Showtime and others. And so as a result, they had to pivot. But early on, boxing and uncut movies were really the foundation. Also comedy, because they gave all these comedians, I mean, look, if you were a comedian in the late 70s or in the 80s, your dream was to get on Johnny Carson, right? And if you went on Johnny Carson, you basically get 4.5 minutes. You come out of the curtain, get 4.5 minutes, you do your stand-up, and the network censors had already gone through it. So they had like done basically a deep dive on what you're going to say. And there were a lot of things that you couldn't say. And so if you're a comedian, all of a sudden, Chris Albrecht or Michael Fuchs calls you up and says, we want to give you an hour concert. We're going to give you an hour. And by the way, you can say whatever you want. You can use words that you can talk about subjects ever. I mean, look, George Carlin literally in his HBO comedy concert, one of his early ones, does the 7 words you can't say on television. I mean, what better definition of creative freedom can you have? And so I think those were really the pillars early on, you know, boxing, uncut movies, and giving that freedom to comedians and musicians.
Other than the sports element, when you look at the model for HBO in the 70s and even into the 80s and beyond, it really parallels what's going on today with the streaming service. You look at what, I mean, it's almost like Netflix took a Harvard Business School study of how did HBO become HBO, and then just started playing it. They started with the licensing of catalogs to, you know, have movies to stream. Then they put their toe in the water with 1 or 2 shows. Then they started bringing in bigger talent. They do comedy. They do all of these things that the traditional networks aren't doing well. And they're spending the kind of money that HBO, because it's HBO now, isn't willing to spend. So you almost have a repeat going on right now. Is that how you view it, having gone through this?
Absolutely. And it's even worse than that, because HBO can't compete with Netflix financially. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, but 2 big ones. You know, the Wall Street considers Netflix a tech company, so they don't have to show profits. I mean, Time Warner and then AT&T and soon Discovery, and those are media companies. They have to show profits or else they're going to lose their investor base. So that's the first thing. The second is the Department of Justice basically gave, you know, a free pass to Netflix. There were no problems there. And meanwhile, you know, even when AT&T bought Time Warner, there was a 17-month hold on it because they were so restrictive. So I think that, you know, for HBO, it is kind of like deja vu. What they did to the broadcast networks back in the 70s and 80s is being done to them now. And the question is, and this is something that you write about all the time, and we'll be dealing with this for, you know, at least the next few years. Is there anything that HBO or NBC or any of these other companies outside of Netflix can do to kind of slow Netflix down and somehow survive when people are starting to pay more and more attention to how much money they're spending on these streaming services?
The beauty of HBO as a topic, which I'm sure you thought about a lot before you dived into this book, is that because it has been a unit of other media companies since its inception, it sort of rides the waves of all of these eras of media, from the rise of cable channels through the, you know, the dot-com boom of the late 90s, early 2000s to what's going on today. You know, when looking at that era of the Time Warner AOL merger, did you, when you're talking to these people, the ones that are still alive, did they recognize in retrospect the role that HBO was playing at Time Warner, or was this just like, did they recognize what they had? Is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer changes through the years, but I think your point is an excellent one. And I tried to make it basically on page 1 of the book, which is you've never been able to buy a stock called HBO. They
Right.
always had a parent. And so as a result, there were some advantages to the Time and Warner merger. Um, and, but you look at Time Warner when they bought AOL, that was a disaster for HBO. I mean, they were less affected by it than one might think, but all of a sudden it was like they wanted AOL advertisers to have special favors on HBO, and they wanted HBO programming to be exclusive to this portal and that port. I mean, it was a ground war in Southeast Asia, and I think that we saw it again. You wrote about it a lot. I write about it in the book. AT&T. I mean, John Stankey's very, very open in the book. He said we paid a premium for this company, and we expect to do things a bit differently. And as a result, it put a whole new level of pressure on HBO. And it wasn't a happy time.
You are very judicious with the way you handle the AT&T people. I think I would be less so if I were describing them. But it just seems from all the people you interview that they didn't know what they were doing. Do you agree with that?
Well, it's funny. There's 3 scenarios that I kind of lay out in the book. The 2 that kind of like got away, one was Apple had a real interest in HBO, but they didn't want the Turner part of Time Warner because that's the bundle and that's advertising. And, they're worried about it. And Tim Cook said something very interesting at the time. He said, look, we know what we do here at Apple. We have a very limited product line and our investors know what we do. And we like to stick to what we do. So they said no to Time Warner. Disney, I mean, no offense against Bob Iger, one of the most successful media executives of the last quarter century, but he went and bought Fox instead of Time Warner. I thought Time Warner would have been a much better purchase because they could have taken Turner Networks and ESPN, spun those out, and I think you would have also controlled like the superhero business and all those franchises.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just would have
been. You could have Wonder Woman team up with Black Widow.
I mean, it's unlimited, and not to mention the parks and everything. Bob didn't want to do that, but I would say that when it comes to AT&T, they were actually more confident about getting into this business than Apple and Disney, and they had never been in the business before. This was, the whole, sorry to sound like a stupid MBA guy, but this is the whole vertical integration is great and it's easy. And, we kind of know what we're going to do. In fact, one of the things that Jeff Bewkes says in the book is he said, look, AT&T wasn't our first choice, but at least we thought with AT&T, they're not going to fire our people because they've never done this before. And lo and behold, there were a lot of people that left and a lot of people that
I don't know if I believe him. I think that is, it seems intentionally naive on his part.
But you could make the case. Why would you think that AT&T, that's never really worked in Hollywood and in this kind of content, would come in and say we know how to do this better?
I don't know. I just think that in when these big mergers happen, the conqueror tends to want to impose its will on the conquered. And Bewkes had been looking for a deal for a long time, so I think he may have kind of rationalized this one in his head. Quick separate topic for a moment. I have to ask you about my favorite interview in the entire book, Barbra Streisand. So there's a segment describing the concert that she did at her home, and it seems to me that she thinks one thing and everybody else thinks another thing about how that concert happened, who was there, and the purpose of it.
Well, it's really her versus Michael Fuchs, because Fuchs he's very,
for those who don't remember.
So basically Barbara gave it was an incredible event at the time. And even if you look back on it, it's at her house. I mean, the lighting alone is beautiful. And it was a fundraiser for the Democratic Committee, basically Democratic Party, and particularly a couple key races that year. They were trying to get control of the Senate. And for Fuchs, it was kind of like a Faustian bargain, which is, well, she hasn't appeared. I mean, she hasn't done a concert in a long time, and it's in her backyard. And oh my gosh, we can't say no to this, but we don't want to make it a political event. And so Fuchs says to me, I was on the phone with Barbara and making sure that she wasn't going to say this. And I told her she couldn't say this. And I told her she couldn't say this. And then Barbara says to me, that never happened. I was going to say whatever I wanted. I mean, it was clear what the event was for, and we had the final edit on it. And that's crazy. And so, I mean, again, you're in one of those Rashomon situations. I'm going to go with Barbara, not just because I adore her, but because I think she would never have agreed. You don't tell Barbara what she's allowed to say in her backyard. That just seems like a bridge too far to me. I mean, she understands the business and she understands what HBO needed to do and didn't want to do. And I think she walked the line really well that night. But she wasn't afraid of saying anything. And the idea that Fuchs was going to tell her, I just don't buy it.
Yeah, it was just funny that she was talking about how much money they raised and all these big donors that showed up, and then you cut to Michael Fuchs talking about the ratings and everything else, and it's almost like it was two different events, even though it was the same thing.
Yeah. Well, those are fun to line up against each other.
Yeah. I'm always interested in your process. I asked you when we chatted for my newsletter about who said no to you, but I want to ask a follow-up to that, which is, what do you do when someone says no? When someone that you really want says no to a book like that, how do you approach the process?
Well, so it happened with Dennis Miller, who had a TV show on, and Dennis, who I had interviewed for the SNL book and the ESPN book, because he was part of ESPN's football coverage for a while. I think the HBO series ended on a bad note for him, and I think that I was told, at least by somebody close to him, that he really didn't want to go back and revisit that. But what I did do was, I did a hard target search for everybody I knew that was close to him and did my begging that way, and tried to keep the door open to the last minute. I hate when somebody says no, and thank God there were 757 interviews for this book, so it wasn't like I should feel sorry for myself. But
who's someone you convinced?
What's that?
Meaning, who's someone who said no, and then you say okay, and then you start doing reporting, and then all of a sudden it's a yes?
Oh my God, 100 people.
Yeah, that must happen all the time.
Yeah.
So what is it that puts those people over the top, or is it different every time? Is it because they're afraid that others are telling their story?
I think sometimes that's the case. I think sometimes through my reporting, I may come up with something that may or may not have happened. And I say to him, look, I need you to weigh in on this. This is important because I'm trying to do a book of records. So, let me know. I think particularly like so many things happen in the shows, particularly like Game of Thrones and Veep and Girls. And I mean, Lena Dunham,
book.
I had to, ask all those people. I mean, Julia Louis-Dreyfus about Veep. I mean, certain things I was told, and it's like, did that really happen? Did it happen that way? I think they're very eager to make sure that people understand that, what really happened. And so I think there's, benefit to that. And then some of these people, quite frankly, even though they may not want to, I may have interviewed them in the past or worked with them on other books, and there is kind of like a trust factor. So they'll say, okay, but I wish you weren't writing this book.
Right. The book's been out a couple months now. What's the most interesting, funniest, most surprising response you've gotten from someone who's in it?
I think it was Sheila Nevins, who was really one of the great. She's, documentary queen and a very, very important person in HBO's history and in the history of documentaries. And she wrote me a lovely note. And she said, thank you for letting me see myself in a way that I never saw myself before. because one of the things that happens in the books, and particularly in this one, is a lot of people didn't tell Sheila to her face what they told me, or she didn't hear them talking about her in a certain way.
Mhm.
And that was something that was really important to me to hear from people, because I knew that they were either intimidated by her, afraid of her, wanted to continue to work with her or whatever. And so she had left HBO by this point. And I think that, by the way, for good or for bad, I'm not saying that they were, very negative about her, but even she had an impact on people's lives in a very positive way that she didn't even know before, because some of these women, in particularly women who she mentored, never really wanted to be sycophantic types and say to her, listen, you've changed my life, or I can't thank you enough, or whatever. They just kept it to them. So I think that meant a lot. And I also feel like same thing happened with Fuchs to a certain degree. And probably, all the CEOs, and when you're at that level, people have a tendency to kind of not say things to you directly.
Right.
And they may be thinking about it.
So you've now done books on Saturday Night Live, ESPN, and HBO.
NCAA.
No, but I'm getting to a question here. One of the things, and I guess it's true for CAA in the old days too, but one of the things about those three workplaces is that they were all famously hostile towards women at one. Is this something that you think is especially bad in media, or is this just, culture problems everywhere? Or are these particular outliers? Because I have an opinion on this, and those three places are great exemplars of how awful the culture has been in the past in the media business.
Right. I mean, look, it's one of those statements that, in front of a jury, I could, argue to convict or acquit, in the sense that people HBO had a lot of female executives early on. Bridget Potter, who was a key person in original programming at HBO, she was pregnant when she interviewed for the job, and she decided to tell them that she was pregnant. Michael Fuchs hired her anyway. Obviously, Sheila had an important job. Carolyn Strauss, who's one of the most important programming people in the history of HBO. There were many women who had important roles, and so I think that there was still a male's. It was kind of like an all boys club for certain women. But at least I think at HBO, HBO had health benefits for same-sex couples in the 80s. They did finally get on the HR bandwagon in the 90s. It was a little late.
The stuff Sheila talks about seems, pretty bad at some point.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I'm not minimizing it.
Yeah, of course.
But what I am saying, though, is at least before it was fashionable, there were at least women in important jobs.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably something that, quite frankly, that did not happen at ESPN.
Yeah.
That didn't happen,
And SNL, we don't even want to talk about SNL.
Right. Well, there you go. So I think HBO, in terms of women at least being part of the company and playing important roles in the company, was far better. What do you think? What do you think?
I think Time Warner had a particular culture going back decades that was a boys' club. And, yes, HBO had a lot of women, but stories I have heard, I just think much more so than Disney, and I'm not saying any of these companies were great, but Time Warner in particular seemed to be this kind of boys' club for a long time, way longer than you would think. Like, we're talking into the 2000s, 2010s.
That's.
But so I'm gonna one more question, then we'll open it up. People talk about the HBO secret sauce of why they have such a good track record of quality and why they've been able to maintain it. People talk about freedom and letting artists do what they want to do, spending on particular projects, but a lot of places do that. a lot of places spend, a lot of places give freedom. Having interviewed all these people, especially the talent, what is it about HBO that has allowed it to thrive throughout these different eras?
Well, I'll back up for 1 second and just say, I think that the heart of your question, there's a great quote that Ari Emanuel gave me in the book, because they're talking about House of Cards, and HBO was kind of hubristic at the time, thinking, okay, yeah, we'll buy House of Cards because it was pitched to them, and we'll make a pilot. And lo and behold, Netflix says, forget about a pilot. We're going to give you 2 years commit to 2 years, which was unheard of at the time. And all of a sudden, somebody was saying to Ari, well, listen, we're, but they're not going to have the freedom, and our brand is with, talent friendly and stuff. And Ari said to him, nobody gives a fuck about your brand anymore. And that was like one of those moments where you think, holy shit, is the world changing?
Mhm.
But David Simon said something to me just the other day, actually, that I think is instructive in terms of an answer. He said that a lot of places will give you a network note and they'll say, this is wrong, or we need to change this or whatever. And then they'll tell you how to fix it. For much of HBO's history, HBO, first of all, it's not that they don't give notes, but it's not like a tsunami of notes. And most of the time, HBO will say, look, we're having a problem with this, or we don't know how, A connects to B, or we think this character is, we're lost with this character. But they're not going to tell the creator how to fix it. They're going to let the creator solve that problem. And that is a huge deal if you're David Simon. And I also feel like, there have been, when you look at the few arguments that really happened between, let's say, David Chase and Chris Albrecht about The Sopranos, particularly about episode 5, where Tony kills the guy, and Chris didn't want him to do it. I think more and more, what you saw at HBO was them just trusting the showrunners and trusting the creative talent. And the HBO competitors, to get more specific to your question, like they took a page out of that. So if Netflix or Amazon or Peacock, or if they were behaving like a real broadcast network and giving lots of notes and feeling like they were, in charge, I don't think that would be great in this competitive climate. I think it's almost part of being in business now as a streamer, that you have to give that kind of freedom.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm opening the Q&A, and someone asked, what's the next world you are exploring? Congrats on all your books.
Oh, thank you. I don't know. I usually date topics before I marry them. And right now I'm trying to just kind of like, be in the mood to talking about HBO, and just concentrating on that before I start cheating on it and move to another topic.
Someone was complaining about the pronunciations in the audiobook. So I don't know if you have very much to do with it.
There was a wrong file that was sent to Audible, and
there you go.
They are supposed to have corrected that. I was totally embarrassed. Whoever mentioned that, I'm right with you. It made me car sick.
All right, well, there you have your answer. Rich Cronin asks, when will Discovery take over? And what do you think will be the biggest changes they'll make to Warner Media and HBO management, programming priorities, and to overall strategies?
Well, I mean, look, I'm happy to answer, but I'd like to take advantage of your expertise because you've been on the firing line there. I mean, are you still thinking spring? I know you've.
Yeah, and I think there will be a thorough review, but I think it'll get through. I think it'll happen. My take on the way Discovery looks at HBO is, I think they think of HBO as the thing that is not broken in terms of programming executives. They like David Zaslav, likes the leadership there, likes the batting average they have. I think what you'll see is more of a platform approach of what are they going to do with HBO Max. That's the big question that Discovery has to answer, because there's a faction that wants HBO Max to morph into this mega service that takes up Discovery Plus and Turner Sports and CNN Plus and have it all in one big Netflix killer app. There's another faction that thinks that HBO should just be HBO, and then we'll do the other things separately. And maybe we bundle, maybe we don't, maybe we kick it down the road a little bit. But the HBO Max decisions are more, in my opinion, are going to be more platform oriented than content oriented. They like the content.
Yeah, I think the only thing that, some people think about is if they have to cut $3.5 billion, there's not enough people in the world to fire to make up that kind of money. And so what's going to start happening, which is, is it ever going to impinge on Casey Bloy's budget in terms of, AT&T didn't have enough money to program HBO and HBO Max. And that's part of one of the many reasons why they sold it. Where is that money going to come from to make sure that HBO and HBO Max stay competitive? Because the first thing they're looking at is serious cuts. So I think that's going to be another interesting facet to watch.
And they have pressures to grow. I mean, they have, they've got to grow the Max product. Someone just asked, when will they change the name HBO Max? I believe they will change it. I think that there is brand confusion in the marketplace. For as many people that think HBO is for them, there are a lot of people who know that HBO is not for them and that they are not signing up for HBO Max because of that. Others think differently. Do you think they'll change the name?
I hope they do. I think it's a branding disaster. I mean, look, it's very successful right now. They've had a good run, but I just think it impinges on HBO. I asked Casey, what makes an HBO show and what makes an HBO Max show? And it's a little unclear.
He doesn't know. I mean, I know what he says, but does he really know? I mean, Hacks is on HBO Max. That is an HBO show.
Without a doubt. I mean, so I think it's really, I just wish they had never done it, because what they really need is a super structure, a big rubric that then all these things fit underneath. And when you click on HBO, you know what you're getting.
Yeah.
The idea that you're going to go to HBO Max for sports, I mean, it's like, that's a weird thing.
Just call it Max, call it Warner Max, call it, Warner Plus, whatever they want to call it. Just have HBO be the main tab on there, and then everything else ends up looking like Disney Plus.
Yeah.
All right. So Dylan asks, how did the pandemic impact your writing experience? Was it more difficult conducting interviews virtually?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've always done a ton of traveling, and I've always liked, coming to people's houses or offices, and I think it's much more conducive to getting people to really open up. I had a good stretch before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, I guess the advantage early on in the pandemic for me was could still do Zoom, but a lot of people weren't doing anything. So I had a lot of actors and actresses, writers, directors were like, yeah, sure. You want a couple hours? I'm stuck at home. I would love to talk about stuff because, I'm supposed to be on a set right now and we're closed down. So I guess in some ways it gave me a lot more time, but I would always rather be with somebody in person. It's a fundamentally different experience.
Interesting. Yeah, I agree. I imagine you can probably crank out more interviews. How do you keep the files straight?
Well, I've kind of created a system, and I usually have a devoted assistant who's, kind of like my seeing eye dog, because, you want to make sure there. I mean, look, there's some people I interview. I mean, I interviewed Fuchs 32 times. So it's not just that it's 757 interviews. It's, people who like 20 times, 15 times, 10, so it's a lot to keep track of. And
that's a lot of time.
Sometimes I would go crazy because I'd be like, wait a second, I know they said this line to me. I know it. And we got to find it. And it'd be like, in one of the 20 interviews, and just like trying to do word searches for like a specific word that I could remember.
Was he okay with the book? What did he complain about?
Michael?
Uh-huh.
Oh, well, a sad Michael is a happy Michael. I mean, he's incredibly disappointed that he feels like he did not get the praise or the credit that he wanted. He said to me specifically, and I'm not trying to burn him or tell tales behind his back because it wasn't a confidential statement. And I think he would just say it to anybody. He said to me, look, there was only one hero in this story, and that's me. And you really didn't capture that.
Yeah.
So,
Someone just asked why Michael Lombardo left and what is he doing with his new company? Did he go to E1?
he's working, still going to be developing and producing shows, and but he left because I think, as I document in the book, I think that Richard had come to the point where he felt like it was no longer working, and I think that was obviously a very tough time for Michael, and but I think he's regrouped, and I think he's definitely looking forward. He was very generous to look backwards with me, but I think he really wants to just keep looking forward.
Is he still at E1? Like, I forget where he is.
No, the name of the company. I forget the name of the company, but he's running it clearly.
Yep. All right. Any other final questions? Oh. All right. Then I will thank Jim for his time and thank everybody for joining. This was fun.
Matt, thank you for your time.
Yeah, no problem.
And thanks for having me, Chevalier.
Yes, thank you for the great talk. This has been really fun to hear like all the insider knowledge.
Well, Matt knows much more than I do.
I would forget who I interviewed for sure.
The question about how to keep the files in order makes more sense now.
It's already giving me a headache. Like, how do you find an interview? 1 out of 32 interviews you've done, like one line.
Yeah, well.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll talk to you guys later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a nice night, everybody.